are my kids going to have jobs?
More than 80% of the people in this country were farmers, and now 2% of the country's farmers or less. The other 78% of people aren't sitting around doing nothing. The answer is, well, it hasn't yet.
Before we dive into it, your first time on the podcast, give the listeners a little bit of a sense of your background and where you're coming from and how you were able to cobble together this unique expertise. Because I know you've got investing in your background, but I mean, you combined a lot of different things into that essay, which is one of the things that made it so worthwhile to me. So tell us a little bit about your background as we dive in.
All right. Yeah, no, I've done a bunch of stuff in my life. I was an engineer. Starting out, I was an electrical engineer out of college. I had always wanted to build computers when I was a kid, so I went to college, got my degree, went to work for IBM, and I helped design part of their last major redesign of their mainframes, the System 390. I designed a very, very small piece of it, being the guy just out of college. And then a couple of years in, realized that even though what I had wanted to do my entire life was design computers, I no longer wanted to design computers at all. So of course, I knew absolutely nothing else either. I mean, I could design you a computer from a pile of sand, but I knew nothing else. So I went back to business school, went into consulting, not really a people person. So the consulting thing was probably a mistake. And I ended up in bankruptcy consulting, which is less of a people person kind of thing. I just learned a ton about how companies work. You go into a company that's going out of business, you have to figure out from the numbers what's going on and what you can do to try to peel back the onion and find the center, the core that could still be viable. So did that for a while, learned a lot about, corporate finance. And then, it got tiring after a while going to parties and people ask you what you do and you're like, oh, I hire people for a living. So I went to, look around. What did I want to do? The technology thing was kind of calling me back, even though I'd spent several years now with nothing to do with technology. And I looked around, and this was in the mid 90s, actually early 90s, I guess. I said, all right, what's exciting? And there were two things that were really exciting at the time. One was CD-ROMs. Like, you take the whole encyclopedia, put it on a CD, put it in your computer. You have the whole encyclopedia on your computer, like that multimedia thing. That was pretty cool. So that was one, and that was really my first choice. And then the second one was this internet thing. I looked around for a job in New York City because that's where I was, where my family was, and couldn't find anything in multimedia, oddly. But I did find this one internet company, Prodigy, and I went to work there. So what year was that? I guess that was 94. So early in the internet thing, did that for a few years. I was there. I was in charge of finance there, I worked my way up to being one of the people in charge of finance there. And then I got hired by a big company in New York, Omnicom Group, who wanted to buy internet companies. They're a big marketing company. They buy companies that are basically a merchant bank. They wanted to buy internet companies. They hired me because they were looking for somebody who understood finance and understood the internet, and I was the only person on the East Coast. So they hired me. We were not looking to buy companies, couldn't buy anything good. This was the beginning of the dot-com boom. Anybody who was any good wasn't going to sell you their company, right? Like they were going to wait to go public or wait for an up round. There's no way you could buy a company for a reasonable price. So we started investing instead, buying minority stakes. So I kind of backdoored my way into venture capital. So that was, I guess the basics of all this. I then, when I left there, I went to start my own company, started a company, raised venture capital for a few years, got fired by the board, and the lead investor, then went off and started investing. So that was 20 years ago, I guess, almost. What year is it? 18 years ago. And I've been investing since. And it's
well, it sounds like you had a nose for where things were developing. And also, I mean, you got to have a little luck with this stuff too. I mean, it seems like you were in the right place at the right time.
I feel more lucky than smart. Yeah. So.
Well, this podcast will be interesting because I would also characterize myself as not a people person. So we've got two not people people talking to each other on a podcast. I also I still do a little bit of consulting on the side. And I actually found that not being a people person helps because you just tell them the truth, and people actually value, especially in this day and age, like you're just going to tell them the truth and you don't care about their feelings. That's actually sort of what they value. So the exact thing that like makes you not good at drumming up new business is the thing that makes you a good consulting analyst. I also will confess to you, I had this moment. I think I referenced Third Eye Blind on the podcast for some reason, like a couple episodes ago, and there was someone on our team internally who said, I had to Google Third Eye Blind. I didn't know what that was, and I had never felt so old in my life. And I got to tell you, I'm betting that person doesn't know what a CD-ROM is either. Of course, I remember big black floppy disks, but it's crazy how these things that were like so essential to like us growing up are I mean, they're probably ancient, like they're antiques, right?
Well, yeah, we could have a whole conversation about that. How our kids watch Friends, but nobody watches MASH. Like, I mean, like what ended up being things people remember? Why does nobody listen to REM or U2, but they listen to some god awful band from the the 80s? I don't know. It's weird getting old and like looking back, and it must have been the same for our parents. Although I never noticed it when I was a kid.
I didn't either, and I actually had this really jarring thought. I mean, my parents, I had a long commute to school, and they used to put on golden oldies, so like 60s and 70s in the car when we were driving to school. And so like and now I've realized that the 2020s, like timeline wise, like their golden oldies should be the 90s. So to your point, like I don't know why they're going to the 80s. Like they should be listening to the 90s in the same way that I was listening to the Beatles, but that also doesn't seem to kind of map on directly. But anyway, we're a little bit off course. I want to widen the aperture a bit and sort of start very top down, and then we'll get in the weeds and then widen back out. And the first question I'm going to throw at you is actually a question I was thrown at an event last week, and I didn't feel like I had a good answer for, and I thought you might be a good person to see.
Yeah, thank you.
To develop this. And it was the question was basically like, are my kids going to have jobs? It was that frame of question, which is AI is coming. It's going to knock out all these different industries. Like, should they be lawyers? Should they be accountants? Like, it feels like all these jobs are going nowhere, and I don't know what my kids are going to do to make money in the future. So if somebody approaches you with that question and says, well, it seems like AI is hugely disruptive and that we're not going to have all these jobs anymore, and where are the jobs going to go? But widen the aperture there, and then we can drill down into some of the things you wrote in your piece.
Yeah, so I've got there's two ways to two prongs in that fork, I guess. The first is does technology destroy jobs? And the answer is, well, it hasn't yet. It's been, how far are we into the Industrial Revolution? It's a few hundred years. You look back at the United States in 1800, where more than 80% of the people in this country were farmers, and then tractors came along, the internal combustion engine. And now 2% of the country's farmers or less. The other 78% of people aren't sitting around doing nothing, right? It's there's plenty of things to do that we couldn't do because everybody had to farm, right? Just to feed yourself. So back then we didn't have as many doctors or teachers or, any of these other, white collar jobs that people have now. I mean, I have never been a farmer, and I think there's a romanticism towards farming with a lot of people, and some people love it, but I have to imagine that I would hate it, and that is not the job for me. Even riding in the air-conditioned, John Deere tractor, it's just not what I want to do with myself, and I don't have to, right? I think for a lot of people, we now have a choice of doing something else. We need the farmers, but we don't need everybody to be a farmer. So there's that, it's everybody who's like, oh, this is going to destroy all the jobs and nobody will have jobs. Like, hey, that's never happened. So, why? And everybody's always believed that was going to happen and it didn't happen. Every new technology. And B, like, it doesn't even make sense. I mean, this kind of like, if AI took all the jobs, well, all the people who don't have jobs, wouldn't we kind of go off and just start farming and making things and selling them to each other because the AI didn't need us? I mean, AI is not going to farm and give us food for free. And if it does, then great, we get food for free. There's always something to do, So that I don't, that said, obviously jobs change, right? I live in Hoboken, New Jersey, which at one point was a huge, there's docks outside my window. People used to be right where I live. This was a shipping place, right? Like people would unload the ships by hand and, with cargo nets and cranes, and all the bars around here. Like when I first moved here in the 90s, there were still this remnants of the shipping bars there. And the town, after containerization, became a ghost town because all of those people lost their jobs. And some of those jobs moved to places where the harbors, the shipping channels were deeper, so they can get the bigger ships in and all that, like Newark. But a lot of them just disappeared. You just didn't need all those people loading and unloading ships. Now, all those people aren't sitting around here, like their children aren't sitting around with no jobs. They've got different jobs, but the jobs do change because of technology. And that's, so on the one hand, yeah, it's not going to mean nobody has a job, but on the other hand, it means that the jobs will change and different jobs will be important. I think this happens every time there's new technology. I think, an example that's always kind of struck me is, back in the 1950s, being an auto mechanic was kind of a premier profession. You could train for it. You'd take classes in high school. It's a good job. There was some respect to it. You look at the advertisements of the period with the guys at the service stations with their white uniforms. And then over the time and into the 60s, that job became less and less prestigious until it was basically, all right, it's the job that you would get if you couldn't get a job or you didn't have much training. And that's because of the way cars were built and how much easier it became to fix a regular car. And I think that's probably true to some extent of programmers now, right? It was a prestige job, but, in the future, like, do you need as many programmers or do you need programmers to be as smart when they can use AI? Probably not, right? There's going to be, like, as with auto mechanics, there'll be this bifurcation where some people go on to be the auto mechanics for the race cars, right? Like the people who are like the high end, the people who are designing engines, like these people have very good jobs, right? They're still extremely well respected. But most auto mechanics, less so. So there's this bifurcation. I think that's probably already true to some extent with programmers, but will become more so, where there'll be people who are like the ones who are actually creating the AI tools and everybody else who's kind of just using them.
Well, you mentioned having kids. I mean, I have kids too. So like, what are you hoping your kids will study or specialize in? Or like if you are a parent and you're raising kids in this environment, like where does your spidey sense that things are going to go? Because you lined it up correctly once. So where do you think it lines up again the second time?
I think it's jobs that are high touch, where you actually need to be talking to a person. So you mentioned law. When I, talk to a lawyer, I talk to a lawyer. I don't fill out a form online, send it off to some lawyer who then creates a document. That's not what happens, right? I sit down, I talk to a lawyer. I want to hear their opinion. They have a high level view of what's going on and they can talk to me as a person. Now that said, those lawyers should become a lot more efficient, right? So they should be able to do a lot more. One of the points I bring up in the essay is, if they can do a lot more, what does that do? Does that mean that there are fewer lawyers because there's the same amount of work and each of them does more of it, right? Like you're taking the same pie and divvying it up among fewer people because they're all more efficient? Or does it mean because they're more efficient, they can charge less for things and so the pie becomes a lot larger? And with law, I could see it going either way, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of people in this country who are under-lawyered, right? They might not have a will, they might not have whatever it is they need to be done because it's too expensive. But, I don't know how big that market could possibly be. In some of the other things, like, in medicine or in all the medical professions, right? Doctors, nurses, we could use a lot more of those, but they're expensive, right? So if you can make one doctor a lot more efficient, it doesn't mean there's going to be fewer doctors. It's going to mean there's a lot more healthcare. And I think that's probably true of education to maybe a little bit less extent, but more than law. So I think you can look at the professions that way. I think with my kids, I'm like, all right, if you're in a high-touch profession, my oldest daughter is a social worker. AI is not taking over the social worker job, right? I mean, that's not what the job is.
I should hope not.
Yeah, right. She might be able to be more efficient at some point if she uses these tools, but her job's not going away. That kind of thing is one thing. And the other thing is, if you're going to be in the knowledge business, you have to gear yourself up to be the person who can use the tools to make yourself more efficient, right? You need to be the farmer who actually buys the tractor, right? As opposed to the farmer who decides not to. And then you become a much more efficient farmer.
One of the points you make in the essay that I thought was, it's not a point that's out there very much, because you said, like, this is good for the consumer fundamentally. This should drive down the cost of different services for the consumer. Am I stretching too far then to say that the ultimate impact of AI will be deflationary in your point of view, or am I going too far?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I suppose it could be, right? Well, I mean, deflationary, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I haven't thought about it from macro's perspective, because was Walmart deflationary? To take the kind of the example, parallel I use in the essay, with shipping containerization made things a lot cheaper, like a lot of goods cheaper. Walmart all of a sudden had things that were a lot cheaper than they used to be. Food became cheaper. Was it deflationary? I mean, maybe. We didn't see a lot of deflation in the 70s. That's not what happened. And we didn't really see it in the 80s either. But certainly some things are a lot cheaper. I was just talking to my mother the other day and reminiscing about when I was a kid. My grandmother used to send him a crate of oranges at Christmas from Florida where she lived, because you couldn't just buy oranges at the supermarket, because this was kind of before they could ship them. It was harder to ship them. It was more expensive to ship them. So oranges obviously became a lot cheaper than they were, but we weren't buying oranges before that, right? Because they were too expensive. So, my caveat is always, I'm not an economist, right? So, I do think some things get cheaper. I don't know what that does.
Yeah. I'll trot out my favorite economist joke. Do you know what an economist would say if you ask him or her what the economic impact of the French Revolution was?
No.
It's too early to tell. We can't tell you. That's my impression of an economist.
Yeah.
Well, let's back it up then, and let me throw another macro question at you, because my chosen expertise is geopolitics, and you really can't disentangle the development of the chip-based economy with geopolitics, because the reason the U.S. government goes in and supports a lot of these companies that eventually become your Intels and everybody else who was in the system was because of precision-guided munitions. And if you put chips onto missiles in the context of the Cold War, it's at least part of the thing that gave the chip industry a running start. You probably don't get Intel in the 70s if you don't have the U.S. government in the 50s thinking about precision-guided munitions and the Cold War. So I wanted to ask you if you felt like because you're sort of arguing that AI in some sense is the maturation of this ICT revolution. So should we date all that back to that sort of geopolitical impact? Do you think there is something else going on with AI? Because certainly in the realm of global politics, like AI is there. China's going to be an AI power, and EU wants to be AI sovereign, and the US is going to be at the cutting edge. And even India and Turkey and Brazil have like semiconductor strategies to help them become at the forefront of all these things. So it's being used by all these different governments, at least as window dressing. So I didn't know where to go with that. I wondered if you had a take on that.
Yeah, so that's, I have a lot of conflicting feelings here. And obviously the US government was one of the early customers of the chip makers. One of the reasons that Silicon Valley is where it is because there were government contractors that are willing to buy things. I was once on the board of a carbon nanotube company. And because it was so expensive in the early days to make these, one of the only customers was the government, because they were a little less, they were actually pretty price insensitive for what they needed. I hear that. Would these things have happened without the government? I think there's an argument here that's probably more subtle than most people who say the government kind of is the cause of the internet and the cause of all the the ICT revolution would make. The government spends money on everything, right? It's like a third of the economy. So the saying the government spent a lot on chips and that's why there are chips, the government spent a lot on everything, right? I mean, if you mapped the government technology spending to the country in the 1960s and compared that to where innovation happened, I don't think those two would really correlate. There was a ton of defense spending on Long Island, for instance, and in Southern Connecticut, and all around the country, and yet those weren't the hotbeds of silicon innovation. So I think the correlation might be a little less. What I do worry about is in the 1800s, the innovation leader was Britain, right? I mean, the Industrial Revolution took place primarily in Britain. And then after that, like the heavy, ages of heavy steel and whatnot took place in Britain and Germany. And then sometime about, 150 years ago, perhaps, the US kind of took over. And that's, it has, everybody benefits from the innovation no matter where it is, because it's not like you can kind of keep it in a box and not tell anybody. So, we invent stuff, Britain and Germany get to use it. It's not like they're hurt, but they're no longer the leader, right? So they're, that to me feels like, okay, could be something I don't want, right? I would like the US to continue to be a leader. And I think I don't know why the switch happened from Britain to the US. I've read a lot of stuff about it, and there's a lot of things like, they started to take it for granted, the education wasn't good, etc. But there's no definitive answer to why the leadership in innovation went from, leapt across the Atlantic pre-World War One. And I don't know and not knowing that, it's hard to say, well, is the leader in the next wave going to be here, or is it going to be somewhere else, China or India, or who knows? Probably China.
Well, probably China, because it's such an interesting, and I love these conversations because, like, to your point, there is no one single answer. Another one that defies really any easy answer is, there was, while the Europeans were burning witches at the stake, the Arabs were inventing algebra and retranslating Greek philosophers, and then somewhere along the way they started blowing things up and being radical fundamentalists, and Europe took off and had the Industrial Revolution. How did that give and take happen so quickly? But one of the things I was struck by is, especially towards the end of your essay, where you talk about how the companies that are going to do the best are the ones, it's not the ones who are going to build the large language models. Those companies are already entrenched. Your big 10 companies are already entrenched. It's the ones that are going to build products or build services on top of it. And that describes China's AI ecosystem much more than the US ecosystem, because it feels like in the US, it's this, and maybe this is just a narrative, but it's this sprint to AGI, and it's going to be iRobot, and the AI is going to figure everything out. Whereas in China, it's really about, it's ruthless competition between all of these different companies and services that are about making things easier for the Chinese consumer and rolling those things out based on that. And I don't think we have quite gotten there in the US yet. We're still chasing some kind of holy grail, and it's almost like the holy grail needs more of the narrative behind it so that OpenAI can get more money and more press releases about this cooperation agreement with Oracle or this cooperation agreement with NVIDIA. So it would seem to suggest that China is in the pole position.
Well, so I think you're making the assumption that AI is the next technological revolution, which it may be, I don't know. But there's also, you look at the Arab countries when Europe was a backwater, and one of the reasons they had more innovation, more intellectual thought, was because they allowed it, right? I mean, it was a more open society then. And then you look at, the US and Britain and even Germany when it was an industrial powerhouse, and they were also open societies. To the extent that China is not as much of an open society, you wonder if that, pushes against them doing better. To the extent that, our society here is becoming less open as we speak, you wonder if that's hurting, future innovation. I mean, obviously it is, right? You certainly hear about graduate positions going unfilled because there's no money, people don't want to come from other countries. So, I worry about that. To some extent, you'd think, like, if you were European, you'd say, this is your moment. Like, you could actually do something about this and retake the pole position if you wanted to. But although it seems hard politically for them to do that. But yeah, I don't know if we knew why, and that's, something I've always wanted to do more research on. There's so many things I want to do more research on. If we had a better idea why these things changed leads, then we could maybe say, all right, here's what we need to do. Although I think to some extent we kind of know, like, you do need to support basic R&D because that's not something the market does, right? It's too uncertain for, VCs don't support R&D, they support commercialization. So the government has to support R&D to some extent, probably to a large extent, or big companies that are trading that off, for some government favoritism, like AT&T used to do back in the 50s and 60s. You need that. You need to have education. You need to have the ability to experiment, to make mistakes, that kind of stuff. We know those things are true, right? Or at least they seem to be, to me, to be certainly true.
Well, yeah, and there's always an inflection point. And you even talked about this in your essay. You talked about how one of the differences between AI and between the dot-com bubble was that with AI, you're sort of seeing an immediate pushback in some sense, whereas with the rise of the internet, there was this feedback mechanism where people could sort of dream that things could go. You could put the genie back in the box, sort of. And I don't know. That's interesting because I don't know what that inflection point, or how to measure that inflection point in a society where you turn against innovation. Because you might remember when the pandemic kicked off, you had people in not just the US and the UK, other developed countries, claiming that 5G cell towers were causing the virus and wanting to burn down like 5G cell towers. I thought I read about this in U.S. history. Wasn't this the Luddites? Like, I can't believe we're doing this again. The radical turn against advances in biomedical technology. Like, we created a vaccine for a virus in a year, and we still have a huge cultural chasm in our society about what that virus is, rather than oh my God, we did that in a year. That would have taken decades if you had like given a medical scientist that sort of horizon 100 years ago. They would have told you that it was completely fake. So it does feel like there's been, well, I don't know, it's a feeling, so I can't really quantify it, but I don't know how to quantify that inflection point.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Because if you go back to like, when PCs were coming out, right, in the 70s, on the one side, you had people who wanted these things to stay the same, right? There was the power structure in place that said, let's not change anything because we're making a lot of money and we want it that way. And then there was the other side, the people, like the left at that time, who were like, you know what? All this new technology is bad. We should all go back to living on communes and farms, right? I mean, there was the whole Earth catalog, right? I mean, all that stuff was happening then. Like, nobody wanted computers. Like, there was a small group of people, and people, I think, exaggerate in their head how many there were. But it was this tiny group of people who were like, oh, maybe have my own personal computer, right? 40% of the country was saying like, you're just going to use it to make bombs and we should stop. And the other 40% were saying like, you know what, let's just buy more cars. And there was this tiny group in the middle. And I think that's always true. Like, I think that's true all the time. The difference then was that people didn't look at Apple computer and say, wow, we need to stop them, right? Because because nobody thought it was going to be anything. Like the 80% of people who didn't want it were like, well, that's just a toy. Right. So I talk about this in the essay, like this is the surprise. People were kind of like, well, and I mentioned I actually did this. I went back and searched through the New York Times archive for mentions of personal computers, home computers in the 1970s and 1980s. And really until the IBM PC in 1981, there were like 5. I mean, it was like 2 a year. It was like really, and it's just one newspaper, but nobody in the mainstream was paying attention to Apple before it went public and IBM brought a personal computer out. Like that whole thing that we, have mythologized, at least in my head, the Steve Jobs and the Altair and all that stuff in the late 70s, the TRS-80, the PET computers, Commodore, like Intel, the microprocessors, nobody was paying attention to that in the mainstream. Like it's just, we've totally looked backwards and said, this was so important then, they must have known. And they didn't know. Whereas today, everybody knows that AI is important, right? Everybody's arguing about it from day one. Like the day ChatGPT was released, people were arguing on Twitter about it. There's no surprise. Like, so the 40% who think it's awful, right? The left, you go on Blue Sky, like everybody hates AI. And, the 40% who's like, all right, well, as long as it doesn't overturn the existing power structure where I make my money, they're like, okay, let's tamp this down. And that's everybody now, right? It's not like those people aren't paying attention. They are paying attention. So I think it's hard to, I don't think there's a difference now between now and then. I think it's just a difference of like, people know about it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry, that was a little.
No. That's a fair point. And also to your point about openness in society, Kaiser Kuo, who runs the Sinica podcast, had a great essay about this last week, and I actually invited him on the podcast. He's going to come on next week, and he talked. It's a very jarring essay. He talks about whether the United States and the West needs to hand the baton of modernity over to China, whether China isn't where modernity is continuing to advance, and based on the results that China has achieved, maybe we need to rethink the way that openness actually does lead to innovation in the economy, because they're getting more results out of their economy than they are to the United States. I don't know quite that I buy it, but it's it touches on what we're talking about here. It's a very compelling sense that maybe something is changing and that there's a different sense of society that might be best for this.
Although, you and I think, remember when Japan was going to put us all out of business, right? I mean, that,
of course,
late 80s, Japan Inc. And that didn't happen. I don't know. Yeah, and I know this is it's irrational for me to believe this because I believe it, and so I'm saying this because I believe it, not because, and it's not. I don't believe it because it's there's evidence. I have found evidence because I believe it, which isn't how you're supposed to do things. But I really think an open society, it creates more innovation. And China's not an open society. On the other hand, I want there to be an open society. I hate being told what to do. I don't want to live under authoritarian regime like China has. So it's hard for me to say whether I'm wishing this to be true or I believe it's true. And, but I don't know. I think it's too early. It's, saying that, China's had a few good years and thus, that's forever. Taking 2 points and drawing a straight line out into, infinity is not how things work. But I think it's worth worrying about, certainly.
The guru who trained me was George Friedman, and the first book of his that really made waves was The Coming War with Japan, which was published in the early 1990s. And George would be the first to tell you that the war is still coming. He might have been a little bit early, but it will arrive here eventually. My understanding, by the way, is that it didn't do that well in the United States, but was a runaway bestseller in Japan. The Japanese soaked it up because they wanted to hear all about it. I wasn't planning on asking you this, but it kind of dovetails with what you said, and I'm curious, as somebody who's been in the internet space, do you have a take on Bitcoin and on cryptocurrency in general? Do you think that is a mechanism for individual expression in the world that is emerging, or just curious if you have anything there? I've been very skeptical of Bitcoin until the last sort of 6 to 12 months, and have been coming around to it for lots of different reasons that the listeners probably know.
I appreciate the blockchain as a technical artifact. Like it is a feat of technology. Like the innovation in the idea and the implementation of the blockchain is amazing. I love it. I've read the papers. As an engineer, it fascinates me. I don't think that any government is going to give up its control over fiat, right? This is a major level of control. Like the U.S. government controls the dollar. They are not going to say, hey, let's create a currency that we can't control. They're just not going to allow that. And I think if anything, like what's happened in the past, 9 months shows that regulation has a huge impact on the value of Bitcoin, right? The fact that the deregulation is has created so much value shows that, all right, it must have been depressing value before. So people who say like, this is not something the state could stop. I mean, it's silly, right? It's not like if you decided you had to flee the country because, the authoritarians were taking over and you took your Bitcoin, it's not like you could go somewhere and just be like, okay, well, taking this with me and they can't stop me. I mean, they could stop you, right? I mean, it's maybe harder to stop than if you're trying to leave the country with, $1 million in, gold ingots. But in some ways, I think the gold ingots are easier to have through some sort of crisis than the Bitcoin. I don't know. I don't believe as using it as money makes a lot of sense.
I was reading a paper by Alex Gladstein, who has been writing about the intersection of Bitcoin in particular and human rights, and talking about how this conversation really has to happen at two levels. In the West, where we have modern financial institutions and the dollar and fiat and banks, like this is a plaything. Like people want to play with it and they can speculate with it, everything else. If you are in Egypt, or if you're in some Cuba or some environment like that, or Afghanistan, and you are trying to protect what value you have, then the use case for Bitcoin, the risk reward, all of it makes a lot of sense, because if you have good hygiene around what addresses you're using and how you're using wallets and things like that, like you have a better chance at protecting your money from, say, the Taliban if it's in Bitcoin and you can get it out, versus if it's in the gold ingots or whatever the currencies are. So there's like a mismatch there between the true place where it could be revolutionary is not the place where most of the conversation is happening. So I don't know. That's something I've been wrestling with a little bit too.
But if the Taliban decided that they were no longer going to allow money to be transferred to places where it can be converted into Bitcoin, they could decide that, right? I mean, in the sense that they control the banking infrastructure in their own country. So unless your money's already out of the country,
Yeah, I mean, well, it's peer-to-peer though, so it doesn't really matter if you've got it in Bitcoin and you can send it peer-to-peer. There's nothing that they can really do.
Oh, yeah.
Now they can.
Well, once it's in Bitcoin, sure.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to convert money into Bitcoin, I mean, that's the weak point to me, is the conversion piece.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, that's a little off topic. To get back into the essay, one of the interesting things that I wanted to pick at that you wrote about was that you were talking about whether AI could start the next technological revolution, and you said if it did, that experimentation would become cheap and distributed and permissionless, sort of like guys like you in their garage building computers and getting interested in these things and being able to do it a lot more cheaply. That paragraph. Yeah, sorry.
You have to flip the causality there. It would have to be cheap and permissionless to start the next revolution, or
Yes.
vice versa.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
And that paragraph stuck out so much to me because, and I was curious if you're seeing this from your vantage point. I feel like that is maybe beginning to start. And I have just two data points for this. The first is, and you've probably seen some of these reports lately, that ChatGPT or AIs in general have generated something like 50% of everything that's on the internet, and by next year it'll be 90%. And the language models are just now training themselves on the slop that language models put out beforehand, and it's just this endlessly regressive curve where they're just all going to be like, there's going to be nonsense if you don't have real human creativity and innovation at the core of the content. Like eventually the models are just going to become really stupid, which is sort of point A. And then point B, talking to both investors or companies, people are beginning to understand that their data is incredibly precious. And if they can protect and gate their data internally and build internal models that allow them to say, okay, I have proprietary data and I have a proprietary model, and this is going to give me insights. And it's almost like an information edge again, because if I can harness this edge again, then I'm going to be able to do better at selling soybeans than the other guy, or distributing HVAC equipment parts than the other guy, because I have the best data set and I have the tools that actually allow it to work. Have you seen that shift yet? Because I feel like I'm starting to see that shift in the zeitgeist, but it feels very early.
Yeah, no, I have. And so just keep in mind, I wrote that essay back in April, May, just given the, lead times in the publishing, which was, a little frustrating. Like, usually when I write something, I hit publish and it goes out immediately. And then between during June, July, and August, I was like kind of a little worried that like it was going to become, completely like, oh, did you write that 10 years ago? But yeah, no, I mean, you see like a lot of stuff happening that like the small language models, right? Like the more focused models, the models where like, it turns out the training itself is the expensive part, but the running it's not. I mean, I know several people who are running small models on their laptops. They're not fast, but my TRS-80 wasn't fast either, So yeah, no, I think that's definitely still possible. I would love that. I'm not a believer in that this technology is going to bring AGI. I think that to some extent, the performance aspects are, as I say in the essay, evolutionary, not revolutionary now. And I think a lot of the big companies are going to realize that at some point, that spending so much money on trying to make the next huge leap to actual sentience or AGI is just throwing money into a hole, right? And they're going to scale back the CapEx and whatnot. But I think that the training is still going to be expensive, right, for a while. That'll get cheaper over time once they stop trying to improve the models, at this rapid clip. And I think at that point, you also have like, all right, here's a model that's 90% trained, and you can train the other 10% of it, at home on your stuff or on your, corporate servers. Not exactly. I don't believe that's technically possible yet. That I think that the training is pretty much one-shot training. Sorry, shouldn't use the jargon. That's because I'm using it incorrectly. But like you go and you train the model as a whole, and it's not incremental training. So yeah, I mean, but I do have high hopes for that. Yeah, I could see that being, if that happens, that changing a lot of things, right? But and I think the key point here, which I you didn't mention, but it is in the essay, and I think it's probably obvious once you think about it, is that the reason that can trigger a technological revolution is that when you have like thousands or millions of people trying different things, somebody comes up with like something that really makes sense. And nobody knows what to do with it, right? Because it's new. And you think about like the spreadsheet, right? Personal computers were around for a decade, well, not a decade, but for years before the spreadsheet came around. And then the spreadsheet really made it useful. And before the spreadsheet, people were like, what do I do with this thing? People bought them because they were fun. They played games on them, but there wasn't a real business use for it. Or, there was no business case to buy a personal computer before the spreadsheet. Like you wanted to like use it for word processing. Well, there were dedicated word processing machines that were better at it. You want to use it for accounting, like wasn't really very good at that, And so I think it's until somebody comes up with this sort of, killer use case, then it's, that's what triggers all of this. Triggers the real growth.
Yeah, I mean, that aligns so well with my personal experience of ChatGPT, because I first became aware of ChatGPT's existence because I was literally over at a friend's house and we were having drinks, and we thought it would be fun to just give ChatGPT prompts for pictures that it could create. And it was like, make it even more silly or whatever else. And I felt like for a year, like that was all, like it was just this thing that would create memes. It wasn't something that was actually creating meaning in that sense. We've talked
Yeah, totally.
we've talked around it a bit, but I want to set you up and just give you a chance to cook on this, because I think one of the most interesting things you do in the essay is you make the comparison between AI and containerization. And to your point, everybody knows about the dot-com bubble and the internet and the rise of smartphones and everything else. But you tell somebody about the absolutely critical component of containerization and how it has shaped the global economy around us, they'll sort of look at you in a stupor. I know, because I've tested it out. I've talked about your essay to some people and I say, but did you know how like revolutionary containerization was? And they're like, yeah, like containers, what are you talking about? So I wanted to just give you a chance to explicitly make that comparison and tell the listeners a little bit about containerization too, because I think it's a blind spot for most people.
Yeah, well, so and just to be fair, like this could have been anything, right? Like there are plenty of like late cycle innovations that they could have used. I used containerization, shipping containerization, because there's a great book about it called The Box. There's a lot less work for me to do. But if you go and look up like Nicholas Collin, he writes. He's a European who writes a newsletter, and he writes online, and has a whole bunch of other late stage technologies that he actually thinks are better examples than containerization, and maybe they are. The Sangeet Chaudhary wrote a book called Reshuffle that he talks about containerization as a late stage innovation as well. I mean, it's really, I think so. Just to be, just so it's not just containerization, right? But containerization is interesting because it is a huge innovation that people don't think about. My dad was in marine construction, so I was often on his job sites, just as a kid, and you'd see the container ships and you'd see the containers everywhere, and you could tell that things were changing. Especially like living in New Jersey, and Newark was was really the first container port. But nobody talks about it, right? Or for the most part. And the reason is because it's totally in the background. It's like the plumbing of the world. So, for you and me as consumers, we don't use containerization. We don't even have to know about it. But it has changed everything we do, like from, being able to get oranges year round to, if you went to Europe in the 1980s, like the food they had there was completely different. Like you couldn't, there's things that they make here that you couldn't buy there and vice versa. And that's not really true anymore for the most part. And then on top of that, just the fact that, the rise of China as a manufacturing powerhouse, et cetera, like all of this stuff has happened because of global trade expanding. Global trade expanded because of containerization, because containerization made it very cheap to ship things on ships. So containerization is basically those giant metal boxes they put on ships. And we've all seen them because there's a bazillion of them just, actually, I don't know if we've all seen them. If you live on a coast, you've seen them. I have no idea if they're, sitting around on lots in Iowa or not. But they're everywhere. And it's just, people will put the container on a truck. They'll load it up at their factory, bring it to the port. The crane picks the container up, puts it on the ship sails, wherever it goes, another crane picks it up, puts it on a different truck or on a railway car, and they drive away. Or it puts it on, in a place where they can unpack it away from the ship. Previous to that, the ship sat in port while people came in and unpacked everything out of the hold, put it onto pallets or into cargo nets, and those were then brought onto the pier where they were again taken off the pallet or out of the cargo net and brought to the end of the pier to be put on trucks, like individually. And there were people whose whole job was to figure out, where do I fit this box? Where's the best place in this ship? Oh, well, this box should go up in the corner at the hold because there's a space that's just right for it. I mean, like, it was a huge amount of work to load and unload ships, and ships would sit in port for days doing nothing, just being loaded and unloaded. So you can see like the cost of not just the people, but the time, right? The time of the ship just sitting idle. And that just doesn't happen anymore. Ships do sit idle, but not because of that. So this was one of the things that was so obvious to everybody. Like, well, if you could do that, it would obviously cut costs by a lot, right? Everybody knew this at the time when containerization was happening. It's just that it was really hard to do because there are systems constraints, right? Like the people who loaded and unloaded the ships, the longshoremen, didn't want this to happen. Obviously, they would lose their jobs. They had powerful unions. The people who owned the ships, they owned ships that weren't outfitted for containerization. They'd have to buy entirely new ships. So they didn't want it. The people who ran the ports, the ports aren't set up for this, right? They're set up for the longshoremen to unload ships. They didn't want this. Nobody wanted it, except for this one guy a lot of people wanted it. Other people in the business wanted it. And so Malcolm McLean came along and said, hey, I want it. I'm going to do it. And he kind of found a way around each of these, systemic blocks. So he totally bypassed Manhattan, the biggest shipping port on the East Coast at the time, and went to Newark, where there was nothing. And Newark was like, great, we'd love to have you, right? And New York, which was dirty, crowded, getting stuff out of the port, like onto the New York City, surface streets took forever. The unions were really strong. They were like, we're none of that. We're not having that until he started to actually make some headway. Then they were like, okay. It was a time where the intracoastal shipping up and down the East Coast of the United States was going away because people were using trucks instead. And he said, all right, well, here's an opening. I can put stuff on ships, which is cheaper, especially this way, and just go up and down the coast, right? There were a lot of like little things that made it possible for him to do this. But the thing is that even though he was this innovator and well ahead of everybody else, and he made this all happen, once he made it happen, everybody else could just do it. Like there was nothing like that would prevent them from entering this market. So all the other shipping companies were like, oh, look, it's working. Okay, buy ships, buy container ships. Let's go do it. It's obviously a better way of doing it. We now have a competitor, so we have to do it. And it'll take us, some CapEx, but there's no moat here, right? So McLean made money because he sold his company pretty early on. Like he grew the company. He was the first mover, grew the company, made it pretty big, sold it. And the people who bought it actually, I think it managed to they managed to destroy it. It made them no money. It was an awful purchase. But he got out early. He made money. So he made money. His investor made money. But it doesn't seem, I couldn't find anybody else who actually made money from this, like in the shipping business, right? So then the question was, all right, well, this created a ton of value. Who got the value? And the value had to have gone downstream to making products cheaper for consumers, as well as making companies that sold cheaper products more successful, like Walmart and Costco. So this is like the analogy I use for a late stage innovation.
Well, and it's such a powerful perspective because there's a narrative, I think, in U.S. society in particular, that globalization killed a bunch of manufacturing jobs, and this was all about the export of jobs to China. You even mentioned, I think, North Carolina furniture makers and how they get put out of business by IKEA. But it's not a story about China. It's a story about what company was selling furniture that was able to drive down the cost of it based on container shipping and those advances. And yes, like China had some role in playing those parts, but it really, like, instead of putting the onus on an external national actor that did something to the United States, which I think is I would call that the consensus narrative in the typical American's mind about the impact of globalization, U.S. economic relations with China. It's actually no, if you can trace the beginning of this to containerization and the things that does to the economy and what types of jobs are going to be available and what types of companies are going to do the best, like it gives you a reframing, interestingly, of globalization. And it also gives you a really interesting lens through which to view, okay, and what is going to happen once we stop using ChatGPT to like do silly things as a dinner party trick, and once we invent whatever the spreadsheet is for ChatGPT. And I don't think it's out there yet. I have found myself in using it, it's sort of getting worse, or at least it still can't do like basic things that I need it to do. Like, God forbid I should give it some pretty structured data and ask it to create a chart, and it should actually put the variables where it's supposed to go. It's like incapable of doing that, So
no, totally. I mean, I teach college students entrepreneurship, and I will sometimes ask ChatGPT the question I'm going to ask them to see what it returns, and that's sort of like my baseline. If you can't do better than this. I mean, and it's never a problem for them to do better than that because ChatGPT is so mid. Like it's just everything it does is like you're like, okay, I'm not impressed. You're not doing something I couldn't do. In some cases, it saves me a lot of time. So I'll ask it research questions like, how do I find out X? And it'll go and I'll usually use Anthropic. It'll go out and Perplexity I use. And it'll go out and search and bring everything back together and say like, oh, here's 12 things. And then I can be like, okay, let me click through and look at these things, right? So it's a useful tool, but it's not that impressive. And yes, I find the same thing. I haven't found a use case that makes me, nothing is kind of like, wow, I wish I'd had this 20 years earlier. There's nothing there that's like that for me yet. But again, I think again, like, if you'd bought the Apple I or Apple II even, you'd feel the same way, right? Like, as a business person, you'd be like, but there's nothing this computer can do that I couldn't do more easily without it, Doesn't mean that's not coming, right? We just haven't found it yet.
No, and to your point, there is, a friend of the podcast Matt Pines was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was at Bitcoin Policy Institute, but he announced this on X, so I don't think I'm stepping on his toes to say now he's pivoting to an AI-related startup that is thinking about how to use AI in order to solve sort of unsolved physics problems. And can you create new physics based on like what you're able to use with AI? Well, that's very interesting. That's sort of the medical application too. If you can figure out the right way to make doctors better by using AI tools, like you're going to do incredibly well. We're not there yet. Like people are starting, I think, to understand that they have to productize this thing in a way that the professionals can then use it. But we're not like there's not a universe in 10 years. Well, maybe I guess anything's possible, but like I don't think they're going to stick, an AI brain in my friend here, the skeleton behind my shoulder, and he's going to like diagnose me and say, yes, Jacob, you have a cold. Like you don't need an antibiotic. Please go home and stop pestering me with your symptoms. Like I don't think that that's something that's realistically going to happen.
No, I don't think with this technology. I mean, I think people conflate AI, AGI, and exponential growth and intelligence. Like if you have one, you have all three. And that's obviously not true. It's not AGI. This technology is not going to be AGI, is my analysis. And it's certainly not going to be exponentially growing intelligence, even if it were AGI. We've had AGI we've had general intelligence for, millennia, and that hasn't seemed to have made us smarter. Like
Yes. I'm not sure that we should call it general intelligence. We've had general stupidity for millennia. Maybe we have these pockets of intelligence, but I'm showing my true colors now. I won't hold you to the answer to this next question, and we're rounding in on the end. But you talk about how AI could be the next beginning of a technological revolution. Do you have any thoughts about what it is if it's not AI? If it's something that 30 years from now we'll all say, well, duh, that was obvious, but here today nobody's talking about it. Like, do you have a dark horse candidate for that, or one that you're playing with?
I think nanotechnology. But yeah, this is like wishful thinking, right? And this is one of the other research projects I'd like to do is, could you have foretold in 1969 that the information communications technology revolution would be the next thing? Like, there are certainly, like, in hindsight, you could say, like, well, yeah, I mean, IBM was one of the largest, companies in the world, and it had a really, really expensive thing that people really, really wanted. If you made it cheaper, of course, it would be much more, there'd be this whole, revolutionary change. But I haven't gone back and done that research. It would be interesting to know before each of these kind of big, booms in technology, what would have foretold it if you can get around your hindsight bias. I haven't done that. That's on my list of things to do, along with like 500 other things, and 490 of which are much, much easier than that. So those are the ones that get done. But it would be interesting. I don't, in one sense, I don't think you can tell, because then it wouldn't be a surprise, and it being a surprise is what allows it to form the ecosystem before the pushback from society. But yeah, no, I look at like nanotechnology, and you say, like, what would really change our world in a way, like the computers did, right? I mean, computers, like portable computers, like computers everywhere, changed our world, right? Our children couldn't imagine being in a world without them. And I think we couldn't really either. Like, we had a power outage here during the hurricane, whatever that was, 10 or 11 years ago, and nobody could buy anything. You couldn't get money. Nobody could sell you anything, on a credit card. It was like, we went back to the Middle Ages, like overnight, because the power was out for a week. So you can't imagine life. You can't go back. What could have a comparable impact where you couldn't go back? And it could be AI. Although, again, it's hard to imagine what it would be about AI that would change the world so much that you couldn't go back. Nanotechnology is a little easier to imagine. Like, if you actually were able to design very, very small machines that could do things like manipulate atoms, and then do it en masse, because you could build these machines en masse, these tiny machines. Well, all right, you could see how that could change things in a way that you couldn't go back. And to some extent, you feel like, well, we're like on the cusp of that. But I think that might be sort of a false impression along the lines of like quantum computing, where we've been on the cusp of it since like 1972 or whatever. It's I don't know. It's an interesting question though. Yeah, I would prefer nanotech to AI, but that's me.
No, and I mean, for fans of three-body problem, like one of the first things that the aliens want to take away from the humans is the advances in nanotech. So there's something there. I think maybe nuclear fusion might be there on the list, like something like, I mean, but
Maybe.
that has been a holy grail also since they started the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and you have to wonder, like, is there a way to have nuclear energy, let's just say nuclear energy, in a way that is open and people could experiment with it to try different things? Or would that just be a disaster, like literally?
Yeah, it would be the end. Like, don't worry about AGI ending everything. Worry about somebody, doing stuff with nuclear or biotech in their basement. I'll get you out of here on this, Jerry. And this is something, I don't do this with every podcast, but I stole this from friend of the podcast, Vance Crowe. So I like to call it the Vance Crowe podcast, the Vance Crowe paradox, even though he calls it the Peter Thiel paradox because he got this from him. But the question to close out on is, within your tribe, there's probably, a body of consensus opinions or things that make sense. What is one thing that you think that everybody in your tribe just absolutely would disagree with? Something that you're out there on that you feel very confident about, but anybody that like works with you or is in the same milieu as you would hear that and be like, Jerry, have you had a few too many? Like, what's going
on? Wow. Huh.
It's a great question,
That's a tough
isn't it?
one.
It's the perfect question.
I have a lot of non-consensus opinions, but in our business, that's what people expect of you, So it's kind of like they're non-consensus opinions, but the meta opinion is a consensus opinion. Like, you're supposed to have non-consensus opinions. So people might be like, I don't agree with you, but they're not going to think you're crazy, right? Like, oh, he's spouting nonsense again. That's great. That's what we're supposed to do. I think the kind of underlying thing that people believe that I don't necessarily believe, although if I say it out loud, you'd be like, well, lots of people believe that, in our business, is that the innovation is, it just happens, right? That, like, no matter what you do, people are going to innovate, whether you're involved or not, whatever happens, it's just going to keep going. And I know a lot of people don't believe that, and I don't believe it. Like, I think this is something that has to be nurtured. But people act as if it's just going to happen, right? A lot of venture capitalists are I'm just here to, give them money once they have their idea. Like, I don't need to do anything else, right? Like, I don't need to somehow seed the innovation, ecosystem so that I will continue to have people coming to me with ideas 30 years from now. It's right. I mean, I think people act that way. People won't say that they think that, but they act that way. And it's obviously not true. That's not obviously not true. I don't believe it's true. I've done a lot of things in my life. A lot of what I do is to try to see the next generation, or not to see the next generation so much as to keep things happening. Like my teaching, my writing, like, I don't make money from this writing. I've written a lot over the past 20 years. Nobody's really ever paid me. I mean, I wrote a book and I guess I got an advance and made a little bit of money, but it's not like I'm making a living writing. And yet I spend a lot of time doing it. And I spent a lot of time teaching, and, they paid me, but I think given the hours, it's probably about minimum wage. And the reason it's because, like, I don't think this stuff happens automatically. I think you have to do something to make it happen. And I just, I don't think that's a universal opinion.
No, it's not. And our society certainly doesn't value it the way that it should. Although, ironically, what AI is doing to the information economy might make exactly what you're talking about all the more important. And I, for one, am personally happy that you're out there teaching and writing, because I learned a lot from it, and I hope the listeners did too. So, Jerry, thanks so much for the time. It was really, you feel like a kindred spirit. I don't say that to everybody that comes on. I hope you'll come back on, and when you've identified what the next technological revolution is, drop me a line. You can share it here.
Yeah, we'll do.